Hurricane Ian recently touched down in Florida and caused mass devastation across the state. It'll still be a while before we know the full extent of the damage and before people can really start rebuilding their lives. As people do start to rebuild from hurricanes and other natural disasters, there's a large increase of demand for building supplies, including lumber. Lumber prices have been going down for months now, but with the hurricane season upon us, what impact will that have on prices going forward? Stick around and I'll tell you. As Hurricane Ian made landfall, I received a lot of comments on my videos that the hurricane was going to push up lumber prices significantly. Intuitively, that makes sense, but I wanted to find a way to predict exactly how much of an impact the hurricane would have. So here's what I did. I went back to look at some of the worst hurricanes of the past 30 years to see what kind of impact those hurricanes had on lumber prices in their time, and then try to extrapolate what impact Hurricane Ian would have today. Hurricane Andrew occurred in August of 1992. It was a Category 5 hurricane with maximum sustained winds of 160 miles an hour. It hit Miami directly and then continued on to Louisiana and Mississippi. Andrew caused an estimated $26 billion in damage. To analyze the impact of Andrew and these other storms on lumber prices, I looked at a few different charts. I looked at lumber futures charts for 30 days before and after the storm, 90 days before and after the storm, and then a year after the storm. I wanted to see if there was an increase in lumber prices in the run-up to the storm in anticipation, and if there was an increase once damage was assessed and rebuilding began. For Hurricane Andrew, the results are really interesting. In the days just following the storm, there was an increase of around 7%, but that went down over time, and the difference from 30 days before to 30 days after was really only about 2%. After 90 days, that difference went up again to around 7%. When we go further out, though, up to a year, we can see this huge peak. Well, at first I thought, okay, maybe that was due to the hurricane, but as I did some research, I actually found out that it was brought on by limits placed on logging to protect the spotted owl habitat and had nothing to do with the hurricane. After more than doubling in that year, prices relaxed towards the end of 1994, but were still around 27% higher than the storm. Again, it appears that most of that increase had to do with other factors, and the hurricane itself had very little impact overall. Hurricane Katrina was another devastating storm. I remember watching the news and seeing all of the homes destroyed, people displaced, and the sheer devastation. Katrina cost an estimated $170 billion in damage. Looking at the graphs, however, you wouldn't really know it because prices were actually down by 3.5% for 30 days and down 11% for 90 days. If you look out over a year, you can see a peak, but the further out you get from the storm, the harder it becomes to attribute price fluctuations to any single event. Also, a year later, prices were actually sitting slightly lower than they were before the storm. The other thing to understand is that lumber is a commodity, and it isn't unusual for commodity prices to be volatile and fluctuate based upon world events that impact supply and demand. And while an increase of 10 to 20% may sound like a lot, it really isn't that unusual. In fact, if you look at the changes that we've had over the past year, the fluctuations have been far greater than just 10 or 20%. So while Katrina definitely had some impact, it is hard to draw a straight line from the storm to the increased prices that we saw later that year, especially considering that prices in the shorter term remained flat. Next, let's move on to Sandy. Hurricane Sandy was unique because of where it hit, and while the damage was extensive, it was not as impactful as Katrina and caused an estimated $70 billion in damages. Unlike Andrew, it appears that Sandy did have an impact on prices. The increase from 30 days prior to the storm to 30 days after the storm was about 20%. The increase from 90 days before and after was also about 20%, pushing it out about a year after the storm, and the total increase is about 15%. Again, it's hard to say if this was due to the storm itself or to other factors, but in looking at this graph, which shows prices 6 months before the storm and 6 months after, it does appear that Sandy did have a significant impact. Now, I have a theory on this one. If you guys remember, subways flooded, a lot of buildings were flooded. And I think that because it hit New York City, a place of finance where a lot of trades are placed, a lot of people may be trading commodities, I think that there was more of a rush on lumber prices because the people that were impacted were the ones that think about those sorts of things. I could be wrong on that, but I think that some of that had to do with speculating and betting on lumber prices. So let's move on to the next one, or the next three, I should say, because in 2017, there were actually a lot of storms. In fact, hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria all occurred within the same year and within 2 months of each other. And so I'm going to lump them all together in my analysis. Hurricane Harvey hit the Texas coast and was responsible for extensive flooding in Houston and a total cost of $125 billion. Hurricane Irma hit Puerto Rico and then came into Florida, and Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico and then dissipated before hitting the rest of the US. Irma and Maria did about $50 and $90 billion worth of damage respectively. So altogether in that year, we're talking about $265 billion in damage. And that's just over the span of a couple of months. So here's what we see by looking at the graphs. Lumber futures increased in price by 15% from 30 days before the storms to 30 days after the storms. The 90-day figure is about 18% increase. After a year, the cost is actually down by 7%, but there was this peak in May of 2018. From what I can tell, that peak has little to do with the hurricane. Analysis at the time attributed the increase to the threat of a trade war with Canada and the impact of wildfires and the pine beetle on timber supply. So it looks like these storms had a short-term impact on prices, but that impact died down over time. Now let's look at the latest storm, Ian. Early estimates of Hurricane Ian's cost is around $47 billion. Now, how will that impact prices going forward? Well, in looking at lumber futures now, they appear to be completely unfazed by the hurricane. What's interesting to me is that they didn't really budge. In fact, they're actually down from before the storm, and it doesn't appear that they're going to be going up anytime soon. So what gives here? Are we going to see a large increase due to the hurricane? The data is really mixed on whether lumber prices are impacted by hurricanes at all, and in most cases, there appears to be very little impact. Now, I predict that there may be some short-term impact and some localized impact where there is a much higher demand for lumber and it's harder to get there. The interesting thing, though, is that at this point, the increase in demand from hurricanes may actually eat up some of the excess supply and lower retail prices as retailers are able to move through their more expensive inventory more quickly. So ironically, the hurricane may actually lower prices. At the end of the day, though, the biggest factor in lumber prices and the price of any commodity really is supply and demand. Supply is driven by what is produced or imported, and demand is driven mainly by new home construction in the case of lumber. Even though there may have been thousands of homes destroyed or damaged by Ian, it doesn't really come close to the drop in new home construction since earlier this year. One last thing before I go. I have been talking in kind of a cold and clinical way about the economic impact of hurricanes. If you were just caught up in the last one, I just want to say that I hope you and your family are okay and that you get the support and help that you need. For those who want to help those who've been impacted, I'm going to leave a few links in my description to reputable charities that you could donate to if you feel so inclined. Thanks again for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.